I'm African American. This means that my skin is the color of hot cocoa and my head is covered in tangles of thick, curly, wavy hair. It means my eyes are the color of the night sky and my smile stands out brilliantly from my melanin-kissed skin. Unfortunately, being African American also means the dreaded R word, racism. I first learned that I was different in preschool. A little boy had a toy bird that would chirp in your hand. I asked the little boy if he would share. He said no because his toy only liked people with white skin, which mine was not. Being the clever child I was, I turned over my hand to show the little boy the white underside of my hand. Does he like me now, I asked? The bird still did not like me. Since then, I've been very aware of how black people are treated and portrayed, or not, in media. The recent police shootings and subsequent riots and even the Oscars So White boycott all got me wondering again about the long, complex relationship between black people and media. This leads me to my knowledge question. To what extent does media influence or reflect culture? Blatantly racist propaganda made a big debut after the 1941 bombing of Pearl Harbor. Posters depicting the Japanese as monsters or demons lined street corners, schools, and stores. Gaunt yellow faces with sharp teeth and narrow eyes glared upon the American people. Fear, hatred, and distrust grew. People began to associate these demonic depictions with Japanese people, the same Japanese citizens with whom they had previously had little to no problems with. Even magazines jumped aboard the anti-Japanese train. Articles explaining how to identify a friendly Chinese from an enemy Jap further alienated those of Asian and Japanese descent. The Japanese were no longer people. They were reflections and shadows of the Japanese troops who had bombed Pearl Harbor. Claim. Anti-Japanese propaganda that surfaced after the bombing of Pearl Harbor influenced American sentiments towards the Japanese more than reflecting these views. Counter. After the bombing, Americans immediately placed the blame on Japanese citizens. These views were put into the form of posters. In other words, anti-Japanese propaganda reflected racism in the American culture at the time. Rebuttal. These pieces of propaganda were everywhere. Americans were repeatedly exposed to the images stating that the Japanese were enemies and monsters, which would have influenced and strengthened anti-Japanese sentiments. Therefore, the propaganda did influence racist sentiments in American culture. Many of the techniques used to intentionally alienate Japanese people during World War II are still present in media today, though they may not be as blatant now as they were during the 1940s. Coded words, like ghetto, phrases, and images all influence society's perception of African Americans. Media plays a big role in the lives of most Americans. While we don't really see posters directly demonizing specific ethnic or racial groups, we do see and hear coded images and words that can lead us to believe or feel certain things towards certain groups of people, whether we are aware of these internal prejudices or not. This type of subliminal influence can lead to the stereotyping of entire races. Stereotypes like all Asians are smart or more relatable to me, black people are dangerous, untrustworthy, or thugs. There is also a certain idea about black people that says we all speak in AAVE or African American Vernacular English. Those that don't speak in AAVE are often referred to as well-spoken or intelligent. I do not speak in AAVE, which led one of my friends to comment that I was a white black. I do not fit into the typical black person narrative, which led my friend to separate me from my entire race. Such separation is harmful. Black people who do not speak in AAVE are further degraded, while only the white qualities in African Americans are praised. Claim. AAVE represents an important linguistic aspect to African American culture. Counterclaim. AAVE is poor and broken English that does not or should not represent black culture. Rebuttal. It is suggested that AAVE emerged from communication between slaves brought to the U.S. from the mixing of dialects. Given the centuries-old history of AAVE, it does in fact belong to and represent black culture. Furthermore, there are many different dialects to the English language, such as Southern accents, and AAVE is just as valid as any other English dialects. Now for the media. There seem to be two main types of riots covered in the news. There are black social justice riots, often done when a member of the black community is killed by police in an unjustified or unexplained event. The other type are sports riots, which take place when a favorite sports team wins or loses a major title. Both types of riots can be destructive and lead to injuries and property damage. However, both types of riots receive extremely different news coverage, and the language used to describe these riots varies greatly. First, we'll examine the Fox News coverage of the Baltimore riots. The Baltimore riots began when Freddie Gray, a 25-year-old African-American male, died from traumatic spinal injuries he attained while in police custody. On the day of Freddie Gray's funeral, the riots began. Protesters threw bottles and bricks at police, damaged cars on public property, and set fire to and looted stores. A state of emergency was declared in Baltimore. Now for the language Fox News used to describe the riots. Fox News claimed the riots looked like something from a third world nation. Firstly, this paints the very incorrect and unfair picture that all the people in third world nations are violent and uncivilized. This in turn associates black people with violence and uncivilized behavior. Furthermore, CNN claimed that the streets looked like a war zone. While the violence was very bad and destructive, the term war zone brings to mind images of destroyed buildings and cities, or even the decimated aftermath of a bomb site. The damage in Baltimore was not this severe. Fox News also claimed that rioters were throwing boulders at police. While it is true that rioters threw bricks, rocks, and bottles at police, it is simply not feasible that boulders were picked up and thrown. Fox News played up the violence in Baltimore, making rioters seem much more dangerous and threatening than they actually were. After all, a black man who can pick up and throw a boulder is someone to be feared, right? During the riots, 3 main gangs in Baltimore formed an alliance. Fox News was quick to claim that this alliance was made in order to attack police. However, in an interview with gang members, it was made clear that the alliance was formed in order to help stop the violence in Baltimore. Many news outlets jumped to the conclusion that a gang alliance would spell doom for police officers. They then, by repeatedly mentioning one of the gangs, the Black Guerrilla family, drew a direct link to black people and the violence or the threat of violence in Baltimore. While Fox News didn't hang posters of animalistic African Americans attacking police officers, the language they used created that image in the minds of many people who watched the news during the Baltimore riots. Now for the other type of riot, sports riots. Black riots take place after some form of racial injustice, for example, the death of another black person while in police custody. Sports riots take place when a favorite sports team wins or loses a big game. These riots can be just as violent and bloody as a riot incited by social injustice, though the reasoning behind a sports riot is the outcome of the game, while the reasoning behind black social justice riots can be traced back to centuries of oppression and systematic racism. In 2014, the San Francisco Giants won the World Series. As the celebrations grew more and more chaotic, riots broke out. Rocks and bottles were thrown and fights broke out along the streets. Public and private properties were vandalized as fires burned in the streets. Images from the riot are eerily similar to images from the Baltimore riots, except for one difference. Most of the riot participants to be seen in the photographs were white. San Francisco police arrived to break up the riots, which again mirrors the events that would later unfold in Baltimore. Let's review some of the media coverage received by the events. While the Huffington Post did not agree with the use of violence and vandalism, it did claim that these were only Giants fans celebrating the win. The Final Calls news page also discussed these celebrating fans. While in both cases the fans were later addressed as rioters, the context wasn't nearly as incriminating as the coverage of the Baltimore riots, since these articles prefaced their coverage with the phrase celebrating fans. CNN also referred to the riots as a ruckus and the streets as rowdy. Fox News, in similar fashion to Huffington Post and The Final Call, claimed that these Giants fans were just celebrating. Claim: sports riots are done in the name of a game and should not be excused by the media. Counterclaim: sports are an important part of American culture. American sports history spans hundreds of years and represents an important part of American culture. Therefore, sports riots are done in validity. Rebuttal: the outcome of the World Series or Super Bowl will not affect or change the lives of citizens, although it will affect and change the lives of players. On the other hand, the death of a black person in police custody does affect the lives of the everyday citizens who riot. Firstly, the life of a person has been taken, which is devastating for friends and family. Secondly, events like these devastate the entire black community. When one black man is killed by police, we all realize that it could have been us, and we feel threatened, not protected by the men in blue. Is it possible that the media really only reflects and does not influence public opinion towards African Americans? Does media really encourage the idea that black people are violent and dangerous? Would we see black people the way we do if we cut even one tiny aspect of popular media, such as news coverage? I believe that the media's biggest role is influencing our culture. In the age of technology, media plays such a huge role in the lives of Americans that the opinions directly stated or indirectly implied are nearly impossible to avoid. I also believe that the media does not accurately reflect our culture. Black people that riot for yet another social injustice influenced by centuries of racism and oppression are called thugs and are portrayed in a negative light. Many news outlets focus on all the violence and destruction instead of focusing on why these kinds of riots keep happening. While I do not support the use of violence as a response to anything, I do believe that revolting against the persistent form of social inequality is justified, especially when the language, art, and the biased perspective that only focuses on the negative actions taken by people of a certain race continue to influence our culture and opinions towards African Americans.